Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Samhain blessings to you, dear listener. I hope you are suitably pumpkined up for this special Halloween episode. I'm particularly excited to share this with you, as the encounter took place in the county of Somerset, UK, where I happen to live. Here in the southwest of England, we have a long and rich history of fairy folklore. But be warned, what you're about to hear is not suitable for children or anyone who might be sensitive to creepy content. There's a wider discussion about occult practices and gory details relating to folklore. In essence, it's the perfect accompaniment to celebrate our descent into the dark months when the veil is thin and the other worlds are almost close enough to touch. If you're hungry for more, my guest continued our chat in a bonus episode on Patreon, where he shares further fascinating spooky experiences with rituals, Ouija boards, a modern fairy encounter on Dartmoor, and a ghost or possibly time slip experience. Warm fireside hugs through the ether to my wonderful, curious crew. This project could not run without you and your generous support. I'll be releasing a date for our next Discord chat in the next few days, plus a video of my talk at Glastonbury Town Hall for Karen Kay's Fairy Fair last weekend. I enjoyed meeting some brilliant people while I was there, and maybe one or two of you are listening this week. It's great to meet you all. I'm also excited to announce an upcoming patron-exclusive online workshop on tea ceremonies with our amazing guest from episode 21, Awakening to Them. The workshop will take place in December or January, so if you want to take part in this and access bonus episodes, join the crew at patreon.com/Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. If you enjoy the show, please support it by giving it a rating on whichever app you're listening to, and share it with anyone you think may enjoy it. My wish is that it reaches all of those who need to hear these shares. Thank you for all your lovely messages. I love reading these and keep them coming. You can contact me and find show notes at scarletofthefae.com and find me on Instagram and Twitter at _remain_curious. A huge thank you to our guest for sharing his experiences. I hope you enjoy. This is an extra long episode, so I'll be back at the end for the absolute quickest chat.
I've had a few sort of quite strange experiences. The earliest thing I remember was when I was studying at college. I joined a band. I got involved with some friends who were into similar music, and we hung out and sort of practiced. And one night I was getting a lift home with a friend of mine. He lived in one of the sort of local villages as well. And as we're getting a lift home, I cannot remember for the life of me who it was, whether it was myself or whether it was him driving, but we noticed a strange light in the sky. Yeah, so we were near this hill anyway, so we drove to the top of this hill and sort of parked up there, and watching this light. And then I think, if I remember rightly, there were about 3 lights sort of moving around in very sort of strange sort of fast, slow zigzags, and very, very, very odd. So certainly UFOs to us, because absolutely. I mean, I still don't know to this day what it could have been. Besides it was alien to us. So that was quite a strange experience.
What kind of lights were they?
They were just, if they'd stayed still, they would look like bright stars. They were quite a long way away. They were but they were very white. They were, so again, if they were still, we wouldn't have noticed them, to be absolutely honest. I think it drew attention to itself because as we were driving along, we could just about make it out through the top of the windscreen because it was obviously getting dark.
Yeah.
And in the night sky, you could see this thing, and it would travel. I mean, I couldn't tell you distances because I have no idea how far they were away, but they would travel sort of slowly, so they almost replicating what could be, it could be landing lights on a plane.
Yeah.
But then they would speed up to ludicrous proportions and then zoom back on themselves. And yeah, they were moving in zigzags, which is literally was the thing that made us both think, yeah, this is not right. This is definitely something
else.
Yeah, neither of us could work out what it was. So yeah.
Interesting. Do you know where they were flying over? Could you see what it was that they were flying around, or where that might have been?
Like I say, it was difficult to work out sort of how far away they were because we had no idea what it was. I mean, you couldn't really sort of. I mean, it was. I would have said at a guess, it was probably maybe half a mile from where we were on top of the hill fort.
Yeah.
Watching them. They were sort of, they were very high up as well, and they gradually they pretty much, from what I remember, I mean, my memory's hazy. I mean, I'm 45 now, and I guess at the time I was probably about 17 or 18, and but they faded out from what I remember. Literally, just almost like someone just sort of put their hand over a torch and off it. That was it.
Yeah, it's interesting how sometimes it's almost like they go behind something that you can't see. There's a really good film I think it's called Lights in the Sky on Netflix, and it's this woman who, kind of an amateur filmmaker basically. She had heard about these unexplained lights over Colorado where she lived.
Yeah.
She had a look at some of this footage and she just couldn't believe it when she actually zoomed in, magnified what was going on, and the movements and also the shapes that they were making in the sky ended up turning into these geometric patterns. Really, I mean, she doesn't sort of say what she thought it was. There's not any specific explanation for it, but it is very, very interesting. Have a look at that and see what you think.
I'll check that out, definitely. I think, to be honest, like, sort of getting older and being quite interested in a lot of these sort of things, the mystery of it's probably what keeps me interested, to be honest. If you could read a definitive text on it and understand it, I suspect I'd probably move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
It's because I mean, the one other thing I remember about that experience quite clearly is when it faded out, I had the real feeling that it was still there. And I remember we stood there for I guess maybe only 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, which doesn't sound very long, but in the sort of chilly evening, it seemed a long time. But we were sort of staring around until you're getting a crick in the neck, because I really felt convinced that we'd obviously seen something very, very strange that neither of us could explain, but I was convinced there was something there, and it almost felt like, I think there was a slightly sort of paranoid feeling sort of creeps over you then, that perhaps the thing is there and it's lights out now and it's now watching us more. It was quite a strange experience.
You don't think that there was any kind of time lost at all? Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com.
That's a good question. I never even, to be honest, I'm kind of surprised at myself. I've never even, I mean, obviously I'm aware of that being a sort of, being an important part of a lot of people's sort of UFO experiences. But I've never even considered that happening. I guess because I always had the feeling it was so far away. But I don't feel like there were any gaps. So no, I don't think. Don't know. I don't think so. But
Did
I guess
you?
I'm not supposed to know.
I mean, it's funny because there are lots of reports of UFOs flying over places like that, whether it be areas where there are dolmens, sort of Neolithic monuments of any sort, any kind of forts, and of course military bases, which many of them were built on areas where these sacred sites were. Now, whether they knew about the power in the landscape is obviously debatable. We don't know, do we? But I always find that really interesting. That was one of the most interesting when I sort of started reading about this probably as a teenager. I found that aspect quite fascinating. Like, did they know?
Well, it's a really interesting point actually, because I think if you say you've seen a UFO and it's over a military base, you get a lot of people. I mean, I actually work in that industry really, so I mean even that in itself is quite interesting because I'm working in a trade that's sort of, that probably. I'm surrounded by people that are the least likely, I guess, to sort of see UFOs because they're used to sort of things that fly around, to put it bluntly. So spotting strange lights in the sky, some of them could tell you the exact sort of model number of whatever it is.
That's true.
But one of the most convincing photos I've ever seen of a UFO came from one of the guys I work with, and I've never seen a similar photo. I was only telling a friend of mine about it recently.
What was it about it that?
It was the best way I could describe it was a photograph of a field, and at the far side of the field there was a copse of trees, and in front of the copse of trees, so almost as far across the field as you could get before you actually got involved in the trees, so right on the edge of the copse, I guess, there was a ball that looking at the trees, the ball looked to be about 3 foot, maybe 4 foot in diameter. But the strangest thing about this thing was it was hovering off the ground, so I would have said it was about its own size, sort of height off the ground. So it was 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and it was about, I would guess, about 3 or 4 feet in diameter. But it looked like it was made out of some sort of material that was clear. So it looked almost, to all intents and purposes, like a glass ball. And the photo was sharp enough that you could, when you pulled in on it, it was not detailed enough to see exactly what was going on, but you could pretty much make out what looked like sort of alien engineering. It was really, really odd. There was sort of, you couldn't see wiring and stuff, but you could see sort of tubes and things in there, and it was really very, very, very odd. But I know there's some real boffins out there that know everything, and I'm sure if I sold enough people this about this photo, I'm sure some people would go, oh, you can find that photo, this is from where it's come from. But
Oh, so he hadn't taken it himself?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
But I haven't been able to ever sort of track. I kind of figured a sort of a good Googling, and I'd probably be able to track it down and find it to sort of show my friends. But I've never found it since.
I started getting much more interested in UFOs probably about, I mean, I've always been interested in UFOs, but I mean, alongside this research at the beginning of the year, there are so many similarities. And even the guy that I spoke to in Awakening to Them and his experience, you could potentially say, it was orbs. You could potentially say that was some kind of fairy experience, but it really does also sound like some kind of craft with a consciousness of some sort. We
Well,
just
it's
have to sort of,
interesting, isn't it? We've sort of
yeah,
accepted that humans have sort of moved on in incredible ways in the last 100 years. I mean, you give a mobile phone to someone from
yeah,
50 years ago, they think it was some sort of sorcery. It's moved
yeah.
in crazy ways. My computer just hardly works. It sort of limps along because my phone's so good. I've not had to replace it. But
Yeah.
there's this weird, I don't know whether it's romanticism or what it is, or whether it is literally just because people want to avoid the subject. There doesn't seem to be any possibility given to the fact that perhaps the fairy kingdom could have moved on as well. But
Mm.
I mean, on that note, the experience that I thought was relevant enough to speak to you on, that creature felt archaic, and really there was nothing in the slightest that would have hinted at aliens or anything to me at all.
Mm.
It had a really, yeah, it was, I think wretched is the word I would use. It's yeah, it was, before I tell you that story,
Mm.
there was one other thing that's probably relevant that might be of interest that happened on the hill
Mm.
as well. So I studied classical history and archaeology when I was at college, and after I left, I got myself a job in a record shop, little independent sort of shop, and got
Mm.
friendly with one of the guys who was sort of temping there, and he was also interested in archaeology, and there was a big sort of group of us, and I got myself quite interested and sort of slightly involved in magic and various sort of dabblings with
Yeah.
not so much with the occult groups. I've never sort of really, I'd hummed and hawed a little about joining groups, but then I've been put off with, I've tend to like to do my homework on things, and you hear internal politics and stuff. It's just
Yeah.
better to stay away. So yeah, I sort of went on my own path really, and also it allowed me to sort of experiment with it. And I always laugh when I'm talking to sort of friends who aren't into it, because they ask me how I got into it, and I say, well, in quite a scientific way, really. Sort of, they find that hilarious. How can you get into magic and the occult in a scientific way? And I say, well,
It's lots of
basically,
similarities.
yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of our sciences were occult if you go back far enough.
Mm.
But yeah, I always say that when I was a really young kid, I used to read books and books and books on it, and remember taking out A. Waite's Book of Ceremonial Magic and all these sort of things from the local libraries, and reading through them. And not, I mean, I guess I was probably about 13 or 14 at the time, and so I wasn't really understanding a huge amount of it, I don't believe. But I I was really intrigued, because I've always been of a little bit of the opinion that no matter how mad something is, when people are putting so much effort into it, and there's sort of so much literature about this, and there's no smoke without fire. They're writing about something. There's there's got to be something there. So I felt that although people were telling me that it was, oh, stay away from that, it's a load of old rubbish and all this sort of thing, I think, well, if it literally is nothing, why am I being warned off of it at every step
Mm.
of the way? So as a teenager, I decided straight away. I had I struggled a bit growing up. I had a bit of a weird sort of family background,
Mhm.
and yeah, so I think I was probably had less care for my own sort of well-being than I should have, and
Okay.
so I was willing to sort of experiment with things, even though people had told me how dangerous they were. So I never really got interested in drugs or anything like that. Oddly, it was reading the Satanic Bible, which
Mm.
I sort of like many sort of things that are trying to be a religion, it's got a few sort of points that you think are quite good, don't harm animals, etc. But one of the things that the Satanic Bible sort of inspired me with when I was a real youngster was it didn't really sort of promote drug use. It was, at least if I remember rightly, I mean, I haven't read it in decades, but maybe I'm talking about a different book actually. But I remember reading something and it made total sense to me. And I thought, well, if I'm absolutely off my head on anything, alcohol or sort of any kind of drug, then I could experiment with the occult. But the next morning, I'm not really going to know whether I've hallucinated, whether I've dreamt it. And so I really felt that I thought, I've got to go into these things absolutely, switched on and with all my senses intact, so I can, I can feel or see or hear what's going on, and I can then come back and go, well, do I believe in this or not? And a group of us used to do a lot of Ouija boards, and then we got into sort of other ritual bits and pieces. But my friends who are more into sort of history and bits and pieces, who are sort of less likely to sort of want to summon things,
to dabble.
I remember going out with them one day, and we went to this hill fort, and took a carload of us up there, and basically we had like sort of a few beers and what have you, and we were sort of sat around, and we were sort of just discussing the place. And a couple of my friends were quite up on the history of the place, and they were discussing, I believe it was the Romans when they took over. There was a sort of bloody battle, and I guess because it was a very large hill fort, it was probably well defended, and the Romans were, well, infamous for being just very sort of efficient with their sort of their technologies of the time, really, and how they would sort of overcome problems like lots of people on a hill with spears and things. And rightly or wrongly, my friend was telling me how gruesome this battle was, and how, I'm not too sure where he'd read up on it, but we were talking about these sort of stories and just bits about the place. And then we started talking about local legends as the sort of sun's going down, the moon's coming up. And where we're sat, there was some there's not much to sort of see up there now for the layman. It's one of those places where if you know what you're looking for, you'll see history all over the place, but there's no obvious ruins or anything like that. But there was some interesting stonework near where we were sat, and we were sat in a little, almost like a little ditch. And I wouldn't know for sure, remembering where it is on the hill fort, I couldn't really tell you what it would have been used for, whether it would have maybe been a path into the hill fort, or we were on one edge of it, so it could have well have been an entrance perhaps to the hill fort. But now it's quite overgrown, and it's sort of covered in, there was trees and bushes around. So we were sat there on these banks because we could sort of face each other, and you could sit there quite comfortably without sort of chairs or anything. And we just had a few drinks each. We weren't getting very drunk or anything, but I remember we just got to a certain time where everyone started to realise that everything, the whole atmosphere of the place really changed, and it felt a lot darker and a lot less welcoming. And then there was a breeze started to blow through the place, and it was interestingly, it blew straight down through and up over the bank where we'd come in, as if almost as if it was something invisible telling us to go back the way we came. And I think we tried to ignore it for a while, but then it got quite violent, which obviously meant that it was really blustery and sort of blowing us around. And it went from being a really nice evening chat about all sorts of bits and pieces that we're all quite interested in to this sort of moment where we all realised all at once that actually we've got to get out of here, because it really feels like something's telling us to, it's time we left. And it was interesting because one of the guys I was with at the time, a friend of mine, he was very, very sceptical, and he was very sort of proud northerner. He had no trouble with ghosts and ghouls and things like that. But even he was very very like, this feels like spirits telling us we've got to get out of here. And I remember raising an eyebrow at that because I thought it's got to be pretty intense if he's noticed. So,
Blimey. So it's like an unmistakable message, isn't it? That wasn't mistaken by anybody. There was a very clear
no,
message there.
yeah, and I think the interesting thing is it would have been one of those things that would have sounded, when you get people who really skeptical, who grab, when they immediately toss out the idea of anything paranormal, and then they end up gripping a sort of idea that's way less likely.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that is I remember coming out of that it was like a miniature valley, really. It was this sort of, like a ditch, basically. I remember coming out of this sort of area, and as we walked out, we got out to the open, where obviously it should be windier because there's no cover. There was no breeze at all. It was fine. It was almost like it just wanted to kick us out of that little bit. So yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, that
But,
is. I wonder
yeah,
if you could have left an offering there with whether that would have helped. I don't know if you had any cider with you.
yeah, maybe.
It always makes a nice offering, doesn't it? Over the
Yeah,
stones or something.
yeah, this is true. Yeah, I sort of wonder if, looking back on it, if I was somehow tainted because we'd done Ouija boards up there and all sorts, because it's quite sort of out of the way, and yeah, sort of, yeah, just messing around as kids, really. But yeah,
a good, amazing setting for a Ouija board. I mean, I never actually had the guts to do one because I'd been like you, been reading about all this kind of thing since I was younger, and I just believed in it too much and didn't want to actually kind of do that. But they used to go and do them in high-rise car parks. So not not as picturesque a setting as on a hill fort. That's really amazing. It's not surprising that young people they are fascinated by Ouija boards, because I mean, really, if you're going to try and talk to anyone seriously about that, you're just going to be told to stop being silly, aren't you? And then you get to an age where you get a little bit of freedom and you do start to explore. Now, whether you do that through, maybe you start, using psychedelics and exploring the outer limits of what you've been told about reality from that perspective, or you get interested in the occult and Ouija boards and all of that side of things. But I think it just goes part and parcel, really, with being a curious young person, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I had all those sort of, there's various sort of, mysteries and paranormal books and bits and pieces, and I remember reading them, and obviously bits of it really resonated with me. I was found really interesting. My home, where I am now, I've actually moved back to the farm I grew up on. And
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's what you could call an ancestral home. My parents live next door to me, actually. The house I live in now was once owned by my grandparents, who are both now dead. They were given this farm by my grandfather's uncle, and I think they sort of kept the farm running while he was sort of old and infirm. And it was kind of a weird thing growing up, because I think, like a lot of kids my age, I think I grew up on sort of Hammer Horror and Amicus and all that sort of stuff, like, sort of camp lurid sort of horror films, which I still love, to be honest. But it gave me this sort of, I think, as a kid, I needed a lot of escapism. I was not, I wasn't in a very sort of happy place, and I was sort of crying out for escapism. And I lived in the middle of nowhere. There was sort of very few other kids around, and then I ended up in a situation where I was getting bullied as well, and like a lot of kids get. So I needed other things to sort of take my mind off of it. So the paranormal became sort of endlessly fascinating, really. And also I was well aware that my namesake, who was my great uncle, had died in a chair in what was my lounge growing up. So, and we've had had people sort of go in who claimed to be psychic, and the only one that seems to have come close walked in and said, "Oh, someone died in here."
Right.
And obviously, you don't want to feed them too much information, so it's like, "Oh, it's kind of interesting because he's right." Said, "Oh yeah, he's not a very pleasant person. He's still here." And
Oh
it's like,
no.
it's one of those things that is quite amusing. You think he must be really horrible because, like, surely you wouldn't be that rude about someone's ancestors
Yeah.
if that wasn't the case.
Had
But
you felt that though? Had you felt that he was not a nice
um,
person?
growing up, we had some weird occurrences, to be honest, but none that I attributed to him, because older, more occult interested me would say that we created an egregore or a tulpa. I think the Nepalese Buddhists call them, don't they? But they we used to have a joke in the house where, you know, if you lost a sock, we'd blame this auntie who'd
Okay.
she was the last relative left in that house before we moved in. My parents moved in. When they moved in, I mean, she was very old-fashioned. They'd had this house fitted out with electricity for this lady, and she's you know, there were burn marks on everything where she was trying to light bulbs with matches because she's, you know, she had like old gas lamps and stuff. And yeah, she'd once toppled out of a window wearing this big long white robe, and she had long white flowing hair. And my grandfather had famously sort of woken up because he could hear groaning and this horrible scraping noise. And he looked out the window and seen her lying there scraping his door with a garden fork to get his attention because she just got up in the night and topped out of the window.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
That's a story.
Yeah. Well, because of these sort of stories, we started sort of. I've got a younger brother, and so we started joking. And if we lost anything, you know, if you lost your school tie or anything, you know, we'd be like, "Oh, that's what she's done." You know, she's her ghosts come, picked it up, and moved it because, you know, we've looked everywhere that's sensible, and we cannot think where to look next. So we would joke and say that's in the ghost realm because she's come along and picked it up. And this went on for a long time, and it would just be silly, you know. You didn't have a pair of socks, then the other sock had gone off to the ghost realm with this lady, and yeah, I mean, it was all joking, but I think it kind of fed something that whatever it was, just seemed to sort of pick up on it. And my family, I'm probably the most spiritual of all my family, to be honest. I mean, we were very, you know, none of us were, my brother and I weren't christened. We were, you know, they're not at all religious. They had no interest in that. Very sort of practical, very sort of, you know, practical agricultural family, I guess. And so, but we had this sort of, yeah, almost like a family sit down at a meal and said, look, this has got to stop because weird things are starting to happen. And we always had dogs around the house when we grew up. You'd be on your own in the house, and then all of a sudden you'd hear someone walk across the ceiling from the rooms above you. And the dogs would go mad at the stairs, but really, I mean, they weren't vicious dogs. They were sort of real soppy, sort of setter, Irish setters, which are
beautiful.
more known for being dopey than anything else. But their heckles were up, and they'd be, you know, snarling at the bottom of the stairs as if there was something really nasty and threatening there. Quite terrifying. And yeah, I had an experience as well where I was out the back of the house, let the dogs out to go to the toilet before sort of settling down at night, and I'd heard something in the lane next to the house. I poked my head over the gate and looked up the lane, which is a sort of dead straight lane with a gate at the very top to sort of into one of the fields. And about halfway between me and the gate, there was a lady walking towards me wearing a pale grey. Looking back on it, she did look kind of strange, and she was very out of place. So I sort of hung around more than I would have normally, thinking, like, we don't really get people out walking on their own around where we are. So it seemed like an odd thing. And I thought, you know, I wonder if this person's okay, if they're lost or whatever. And so I waited, thinking she'll come past and I can say hello. And obviously, if she's looking for someone, I can hopefully pointed in the right direction or whatever. And I waited and nothing. And then I thought, I can't hear anything now either. I can't hear footsteps or anything. And I looked over the gate and there's literally no one there.
There's no one.
Yeah, nothing at all. I mean, that's the only time I remember seeing anything around here.
Yeah. What did she look like? Was she a young woman or?
Well, looking back on it, I think it may well have been my great aunt.
Okay.
Because I didn't put two and two together at the time, because obviously the stories about her, the only one that sort of described how she dressed really was when she had this long white nightgown on and toppled out of her bedroom window. But this lady looked like she was dressed in grey, but she did have long grey hair. And I thought, this is maybe,
right.
Maybe it was white hair, I've mistaken it in the moonlight. But yeah, aside from wearing grey, that was kind of the picture I had in my head of what my great aunt looked like.
Did she see you? Did you get eye contact with her?
I didn't really know, because I was a little bit surprised to see someone there, and I was a very shy kid as well. When I was growing up, I was sort of I think I was one of those kids that wanted to be sort of more forthcoming than I could be. I sort of held myself back.
Gosh, yeah, that sounds like it's got a lot of character. It does seem like those old places can hold memories. Either the buildings have keep the memory of them, or some part of them wants to remain there or does remain there.
Yeah, it is. It's really strange. It's sort of my wife's recently started noticing stuff in our house, bits and pieces. She keeps getting the feeling there's someone there. Yeah, I've had a couple of instances where just in the corner of my eye I've caught movement. And sort of when you've got a door cracked open, I've noticed that as it feels like someone's just walked past it and you just catch a glance of a shadow. But that's all I've noticed here, to be honest, in recent times.
If you wanted to clear it, I can let you know how to do that. But if you were just kind of interested and wanted to practice having a go at seeing it, then if you just let your eyes go really relaxed, don't try and focus. I don't know if you wear glasses, but take your glasses off if you do, because what your lens does is pull the muscles in your eye into some kind of tight position so that you can focus. So that's what you don't want. Just let your eyes see what they see. And sometimes it takes a couple of minutes for your eyes to sort of get used to not wearing glasses, or perhaps longer.
I think I should. Be interesting. So yeah, going back to this hill fort, I was in a bit of a sort of weird space in my life where I had a relationship breakdown, and it was a horrible, sort of painful time. And it took me a long time to sort of go out afterwards. And I buried my head a bit. I was sort of essentially homeless for a while. I stayed on a friend's floor. I got terribly ill. I hadn't realised it, but I'd got pneumonia, and only realised it because I had some kind of weird condition. Apparently, it's a reaction. It's almost like the body's allergic reaction, I was told, to the recovery from pneumonia.
My goodness,
so,
it sounds awful. Really,
I was in a really horrible place, and friends of mine finally sort of decided, managed to drag me out of the house, and I more than ever felt like an intruder. I was really in a horrible place in my life, one of the worst. And I met this girl and got together with her, and we were not very well suited at all, but at the time I thought we were, because she was very brash and loud and quite aggressive. And I mean, I'm 6'5", and I stand out a bit, and it's probably a horrible, terrible thing to have to say, but she felt like camouflage for me, because if we walked into somewhere and people looked at me, they quite quickly turned to her, because she was quite she wanted to be the centre of attention all the time. Yeah, so I mean, not exactly a proud place in my life at all. But things got better in some ways and worse in others. She ended up quite abusive, which sounds yeah, it probably sounds stupid coming from someone my size, but
No, not at all.
yeah, so I was in a really low point in my life. I did not know what was going on, and I was getting to that point where I thought I've got to become homeless again because I can't live with this girl. I'm in a horrible, horrible place here. And so I got in the car one night, and I drove out to somewhere where I knew I could find some, peace and quiet. So I went up to this hill fort, and funnily enough, because of the experience I'd had before, where a group of us had pretty much felt like we were sort of shooed away, I parked the car up and I walked out onto the fort, but towards the other side of the fort from where we were when we were sort of, forced to vacate it. I went down into this. There's a really nice little area, not too far from the main road through, actually, that drops down over, and you're then at a sort of almost like a sheer cliff face.
Wow.
And it's a nice little area, and it's kind of hidden away because you go through a sort of like a little tree tunnel to get through to it. Down the path goes sort of down to this, almost like a tunnel of trees. And so I went down there and I sort of sat down on the grass, and I was sort of just basically thoroughly feeling sorry for myself and trying to, have a slight sort of meditation perhaps and think about how I was going to get out of my latest predicament, really. And it was quite a bright night. The moon was sort of lighting things up. There was a lot of shadows, but there was nothing, there was no, I don't know, I didn't feel it was creepy at all. It just felt a really sort of powerful, natural sort of place at the time. And it seemed to be sort of good to clear my mind. Yeah. And I was starting to get basically a wet backside from being sat down there and in the sort of early hours of the morning, I suppose, late at night. And I started to walk back up over the path, which is, it's up a slight incline. And so I was walking up over there, and as I was walking up over, I heard movement, but something large in front of me. And I noticed that as the path comes off of the main path across the hill fort, and so it's a small path, and as I was coming towards the end of the tree tunnel, it opens out a bit, and then there's the other path, and the other side of this path, there was a load of brambles and bracken, and it was just growing quite rough where no one walks through there. And I looked and I saw there was a horse, and I was quite relieved because obviously I thought
that's what the noise.
That was what the noise was, but it was, because it did sound like something very but large. And so I carried on walking towards this horse, and then a thought just flew into my mind that I thought, well, I've seen horses here before, but I've never ever seen a horse on its own, and there's nowhere. This thing must be wandering loose because there's no, there was nowhere you could fence it in to stop it just wandering into the road. And so then I looked up again to look at this horse, thinking, is there a rider? And I was immediately, I immediately noticed it had no saddle on it and it didn't have reins. But as I'm walking towards it, I realized there was something misshapen about it, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then I realized there were eyes staring at me from around the area of the middle of the neck, and they were big, sort of very black eyes. Yeah. And as soon as I realized there were eyes looking from the mane, I realized that the mane, what I thought was the mane, wasn't all mane. It was this weird creature that was grabbing on, almost like a monkey grabs onto its, you see them grabbing onto the mothers where they wrap their limbs around. Well, this thing had its arms and legs looked too long for it, and it was quite spiky. It looked like it had sort of wiry hair and very spiky hair on the head as well. The head looked too big for it. It was, and it had sharp teeth. It was sort of, I don't know if it was sort of grinning or what, but it was it felt sort of, I don't know. I got this at first. I was really struck with like, oh God, I need to run.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me that if I'd run away from this thing, I'm at a dead end because I would be
Okay.
straight back down at this sort of, I mean, it's quarried face, but it's the equivalent of a cliff face, really, because it's a vertical climb to get out of there, and
Yeah.
it's a lot more than I'd do in the dark with no ropes. And so I thought, I've got to walk towards it. And in the moonlight, it was now obvious there was this thing gripping this horse's neck. And the horse was sort of moving and appeared to be sort of eating from among this sort of bracken, brambles, sort of pushing itself through there.
Mm.
And I thought, everything about this seems slightly wrong, because I realised that the horse was right in the middle of it's just right in the middle of all this sort of bramble. And I thought, well, I grew up on a farm, so I know animals will quite happily go and tuck into hedgerow and what have you, given the chance. But you don't really see them in the middle of the hedge.
No.
It's they eat from the sides. They don't just bully their way straight in. And this thing was stood in the middle of this patch of brambles and thorns. And and in this sort of, with its sort of knotted mane, was this thing that, I mean, I can only describe as looking like a goblin type creature. It definitely felt very, very sort of like the old Fey folk stories, but it wasn't recognizable as anything that I'd ever read about or heard about previously. And after seeing it, the first thing I did was I tried to find other accounts, perhaps. I tried locally, thinking, am I the first person to see this? Because surely, it felt sort of ancient, but I've not found anything on it. But I mean, going back to the experience, I had to keep walking towards it, and I think it was the sounds silly to say this, but it's probably the right combination of me being in such a terrible place in my life at the time that I was not as worried for my own safety as I should have been. That I thought, I've got no choice anyway. It's a dead end behind me, and I carried on walking towards it. And I think that's when the thing sort of bared its teeth at me.
Oh, goodness.
And showed off basically a mouthful of really triangular, very sort of spiky looking teeth.
Oh my goodness.
And as I walked towards it, it was sort of stood in the moonlight, because it was outside of it was beyond the tree tunnel I was now exiting, and it just faded from view. And it became more and more translucent, and as I got sort of, I guess, too close, it was gone. It was almost like I suppose actually a bit like a chameleon. It was if you think of a more spiritual version of a chameleon, it
just blended into the background.
It felt like it blended into the background, but which would make sense, because this thing blended into the horse's mane. Like I said, I saw the horse, and it wasn't until the penny dropped that I thought, this isn't a place you see wild horses. It's not like I'm on Exmoor or Dartmoor, where it wouldn't be unheard of to sort of, be walking around and bump into a horse. Whereas this, you see horse riders go over the hill. So that's what made me really look at the horse properly, because I thought, is this someone late night riding that's been thrown off and lost their horse, perhaps? But it had this, I mean, I suppose shape-wise, it was similar to the sort of classic grey alien, I guess. The head was too big, the limbs were long and gangly, but it was, I think it was sort of brownish in colour. It's hard to tell in the moonlight, but it seemed to blend in really well with the it was hard to tell what was sort of spiky, sort of almost matted mane, and what was this creature's hair.
Yeah. So and so it had kind of spiky hair.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it definitely
Mm.
felt sort of spiky.
Yeah.
But yeah, very, very like slightly oversized eyes as well. But
Yeah. What colour were
they,
the eyes?
I remember them being all black, but I
Mm.
obviously I only saw this thing in moonlight. So
Mm.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you could see them shining, and you know they looked large.
And
There
how
was
big was it, would you say? How big was the
the
being?
horse was quite large, so I would say this. I would have said it would be like maybe a 4 foot sort of. Yeah, I mean,
So quite big then.
yeah, I think.
Quite
Well,
big, yeah.
the body didn't. The If it had stood up, I would have imagined it would have to be about 4 foot because it's long. Its legs were really long. I mean, this is a thing.
Yeah.
It was it was wrapped around the mane in a way where it's.
Yeah.
That was the other thing about it, actually, that I should say. That, is a significant detail, I guess,
Mm.
is it seemed to be able to turn its head too far round
Mm. Oh, that's really
because it was.
creepy.
Yeah, well, it seemed to have its back to me because
Right.
it was gripping onto the horse, and you could see, like, I could see where an arm was disappearing over the top, and the other arm was behind, just under probably nearer the jaw of the horse, I suppose,
Yeah.
and the head was nearer where the mane sort of stops, but it was
Hmm.
turning the head back around, so it was looking directly behind itself at me, and you
Hmm.
could see a leg slung over the back of the horse, and then a leg sort of going round. Is it the flank of the horse? I'm not very good with a terminology for horses. Yeah,
Gosh, yeah, that is really creepy. And so it had seen you from the
mm,
beginning, you think, as you walk towards it, and then how far away were you when it bared its teeth at you?
I would have said I was probably no more than 10 meters, possibly a
Mm.
bit less. I was quite close by that point. I mean, I don't know if it was a full moon that night, but it was quite a bright night. It was
Yeah.
sort of, I could make out from quite a distance away that it was a horse. And obviously, I was coming out of a darker area because there was like a tunnel of trees on this path. So I was following the light anyway, which,
Mm.
because I didn't have a torch with me or anything, I'd gone out a bit sort of, a bit
Of course,
without a
yeah.
plan. But
Yeah, yeah. How
yeah,
close did you get to it in the end?
I think by the time it faded out, I was probably 6 meters away, maybe.
Mm. And did it
So
did it change? So as you're walking towards it and it's baring its teeth, and that takes guts. And I know you say you didn't have anywhere
yeah,
else to go, but I mean that's
yeah,
really bold. And it was obviously trying to, well, I mean, that sort of body language of baring your teeth, and that
yeah.
sort of language that we understand from animals, of course, like dogs
Mm.
and wild animals. The baring of the teeth is, of course, a defense and a warning. Did it change anything else about its expression towards you?
It Not its expression, no. It's sort of it. It's difficult to explain actually, but it moved in a. It kind of changed its grip on the neck of the horse when it
Okay.
saw me. I guess maybe to help it crane its head around,
Oh,
sort of
yeah.
looking at me perhaps. But all its limbs almost moved all at once. It was quite spider-like, I guess, because it was gangly, and
Mm.
these sort of sharp, sort of pointy-looking limbs were sort of, yeah, they were. It was quite kind of ungainly, I guess.
Yeah.
It it was, yeah, it was very sort of sharp and spiky, and it was it was humanoid shaped, but it was all wrong. It was,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it was. I mean, I thought afterwards it occurred to me that I thought this, because it's clinging onto the neck and it's got sort of such spiky teeth. I thought, is this some creature that was feeding off a horse? But the horse faded out as well, which made no
Yeah.
sense to me at all. I thought, if I had witnessed a horse, like, and the creature had faded out, I would have thought this is something that, perhaps it was some sort of spirit or fairy of the place that was possibly feeding off of the horse or something like that. It really felt like the way it was gripping and had sort of, when it moved, I noticed sort of long fingers come out over the top of the mane, and it felt almost parasitical. It felt like something that was gripping on in a way that it was not going to let go no matter what. And I mean, as I walked towards it and it disappeared, I think it disappearing really gave me the creeps more, because I knew I had to walk towards it to get to the path, so I could get back to the road, and I could get back to the eventually to the car park and get to my car and get the hell out of there, basically. But I obviously, the path, started. Had it not faded out when it had, I would have been within 3 meters of this creature. So I had to keep walking towards it when it had faded away, and that felt worse than being able to see it in a way, because I had no reason to believe it wasn't still there, because I just watched this thing fade away. And it was really quite creepy, and I really had the feeling afterwards that I don't know if this is maybe this is a usual thing for people to have sort of strange experiences, but I had a real feeling of how would I describe it? A real feeling of being sort of very ineffectual in the universe, really, being sort of
like insignificant, you mean?
Yeah, that's exactly the word I was trying to think of. Yeah, a real feeling of insignificance. So a real sort of, I mean, because I think in the past, like I mentioned earlier, I'd been interested in the occult, and I'd jumped in with both feet in certain areas, and I'd done a few experiments, and I'd sort of messed about with bits and pieces, and I got quite interested in chaos magic many years ago, and I sort of read a lot of Crowley and Spare and various sort of other sort of mystics, and I kind of thought I had a pretty good sort of idea of sort of various things, and obviously I was familiar with various fairy stories and stuff, and I loved them as a kid, and as a very, very lonely, very depressed kid, really, I guess. I remember I found a copy, I don't know where it came from actually, but a copy of the book Gnomes by the Huygen and Portlet.
Oh, yes.
I loved this book as a kid, and I really wanted it to be true. I kind of wanted to be able to go out in the countryside and sort of be able to speak to sort of small fairy folk that, and I think in a time that I kind of needed that and would have sort of thrived on it, I never saw anything. And then I think life gave me a bit of a kicking here and there, and I was sort of absolutely at my wit's end, really. And then I had an experience like that, and it was kind of interesting, because I suddenly realized I was in a space where I didn't really know who I could tell, because I had friends who were involved in the occult, and I had friends who were involved in various bits of things, whether it be sort of new age or magic or whatever, and all sorts of sides of these things. But it occurred to me that I thought, I don't know any of them that have had an experience like this. I don't know, none of them discuss seeing sort of fairies or pixies or things like this. And I think, well, it just seems so weird, because I just think, well, I mean, I was with a group of friends who, it wasn't uncommon to have a cup of tea and discuss, having summoned something when you were, you're in your early 20s, and sort of, having a weird experience where you went round a friend's house and they could see this dark shadow behind you. You're really freaking yourself out, because you think, oh God, I need to banish this, because I have actually been dabbling with stuff, and my friend didn't know that when he pointed out there was something nasty and dark looking behind me. But
Yeah.
But I had friends we could sort of say that to, but I still didn't really feel comfortable telling any of them about this because
Yeah.
I had no, yeah, it was a bit world changing, I guess.
It's a whole other world altogether, isn't it? A whole other category.
Well, I think I've done that thing where I guess a lot of people do, where you think, ghosts and spirits are one thing, people are sort of gradually getting their head around the fact that they're, I've spoken to people before and had like interesting conversations where they've said, "Oh no, I don't believe in any of that sort of stuff." And my answer when I was younger to that was like, are you seriously telling me you've never had an experience where you go, "I don't know what caused that," or and and I never forget one of the guys I said that to was quite an old man I used to work with, and he said, "Well, I used to my first job. I used to they were smashing down a load of old Victorian housing workers' cottages." And he said, I used to have to go in there with like this team and they'd take out anything of any worth and check there was no tramps or kids playing in them before they got the wrecking ball sort of treatment. And he said they stopped for lunch in one of these old houses and he said they could hear kids upstairs banging around and running about and giggling. They thought it was odd because they'd checked the house before they sat down for lunch.
Yeah.
And so they were sort of like, basically they actually had a conversation with them, like, "Oh, thank the gods we've stopped for lunch because, this house would have been destroyed. There's obviously someone up there." So they went on up and sort of did the angry sort of get off out of it sort of thing. And there was no one up there. It was literally a sort of 2 up, 2 down. And they said there was no one up there. No one could have passed them on the stairs, nothing. And I said, "Well, so what do you think that was?" He was like, "Oh, I don't know." And I said, "Well, surely ghosts can't be there's not a bad explanation for that."
Yeah. I think sometimes people just kind of put things in, don't know what that is. I'm not going to think about that again folder and then just try and forget it or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of,
wow.
Easier to write it off, I guess.
Yeah. So you didn't have anyone to tell then. How was that left?
I've told people since. My my wife, I'm with now. She knows that this has happened to me, and a few very close friends I've sort of told since. I think I'm older, and I just think I've got to that point where, I've sort of my friends know me, and they know I'm not going to, I'm not going to make something like that up. It's it's kind of ridiculous. So if I was, it'd probably be a lot more believable.
Yeah, this is the thing that is particularly strange, and I'm really, really fascinated with this, and it kind of makes me think of there's one sighting that I think of sometimes when I think of these sorts of creatures, and this one was seen, I'm pretty sure this was one in Devon or somewhere around the west of England anyway, and it was black and furry and was kind of gambling. It's described as gambling around the landscape. And the reason I think of that occasionally is because these sorts of creatures, sometimes the sort of furry ones, but I mean this one was more like a spiky thing, and to be honest they're smaller than that as well, but they sometimes turn up in sightings in the US.
Oh, right.
These particular creatures that turn up in people's houses and cause they really put people through a bad time, and they often run and disappear under beds and things like that. That's the only thing that I can think of at the moment that is like that. Just sort of thinking back to it, as you approached it, were you still keeping eye contact with it as well when it disappeared? Were you looking at it all that time, or were you trying to avert your eyes?
I was looking at it. Yeah, I'm guessing I would have blinked, but I seem to remember me blinking. I felt like I blinked and caught it fading out. It almost felt like it, because I remember I stared at it and kept it in my gaze, because once I'd realised that I didn't really have a good way of escaping, and I was realistically going to have to walk past this thing, I felt that I needed to keep an eye on it. I guess, yeah, growing up around animals as well, and if you've got an animal that you're worried, threatened by something, you just keep an eye on
Yeah.
it, and as soon as it moves, you've got your
Yeah.
best chance of making a decision whether you sort of run or stand your ground or try to dodge it, whatever. But yeah,
Absolutely.
I remember staring at it, but yeah, I remember blinking and then thinking, because I remember my thought process was, what is going on here? Because I think I can see sort of brambles and bits and pieces behind it. And I
Yeah.
realised that actually this thing's fading
It's
away.
fading.
And it's almost like I wondered, looking back on it, that I hadn't noticed that happen until I'd blinked.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I wonder if this thing has tried to time it to, as I blink, it's going to go away. And I've caught it halfway through.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because even then I'd still be telling you this story, because I was staring at it for too long for it to be something, a figment of your
Of
imagination. But it
course.
did make me think back that I thought, if I'd caught that as a glance, and I thought I saw a horse there, and then I blinked and it was
Mm.
gone, you could be forgiven for going, I must have dreamt that, how strange.
Yeah.
But this, I stopped in my tracks when I first saw it. So although I didn't cover a lot of ground because I was not moving very quickly towards it,
Mm.
um, the whole experience must have lasted. I wouldn't have thought it was very long, but maybe a minute at most.
Yeah.
Sort
Yeah.
of 45. I mean, it
That
felt
is
like
long
a hell
enough.
of a long time, but
I can
I mean,
imagine.
yeah, it felt like a very long time. But I mean,
Yeah. Do you remember where you felt it in your body when you first laid eyes on it?
all over. I kind of tingled. I really felt that it was a little bit like my heart had skipped a beat.
Mm.
I think, because I think I went into almost like shock, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I think, yeah, almost like someone attacking you in the street. I think I
Mm.
got a bit of a rush of adrenaline,
Yeah.
and I felt the blood drain from me a little bit, and I was sort of, I think, probably, to be honest, probably a very sort of natural reaction where a high stress situation where your body's sort of ready to react quickly because you're essentially panicked and trying to hold it all together.
Totally.
Mm.
Yeah. And when you got close to where it had been and it had faded away, did you feel that it was still there? Did you still feel it there, or do you think
Yeah,
that it?
I think so. I felt that it was. I don't know if it was the memory of it or not.
Mhm.
I felt like the eyes were still watching me. I
Yeah.
really, I that is one thing I would say. I mean, I'd love to sound a lot braver, but I wasn't, because I I really felt that once it faded away, it felt like there was something still there watching me, and
Yeah.
there was just this absolutely all-encompassing sense of dread.
Yeah, that's awful. It's
But
awful. And when you made it back to your car, I mean, if that was me, I think I'd have run all the way.
I yeah, I oddly, I felt that I shouldn't run.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, like not
I
give in to the fear or something.
yeah, maybe, I can't remember exactly why, but I sort of felt that it was a presence that perhaps would have fed off of that more.
Mm.
Um, it it felt a little bit like, um, um, um,
Mm.
I suppose similarly to when I was growing up, I used to sort of one of my friends, their parents had a dog,
Mm.
and like uh, the dog was absolutely fine unless you ran, and
Mm.
then it
Mm.
thought it was a police dog, and it would grab hold of you and pull you to the floor, and it it felt a little bit like that. I
Yeah.
felt almost like I'd be drawing too much attention to myself, whereas if I sort of just carried on walking, I mean, I think I probably walked faster than I than I than I had been, but I tried to walk away as if to say, I didn't know how to communicate to this thing, but I almost felt like I needed to say, look, don't harm me. I'm not harming you. I'm literally just clearing off, and
Yeah.
this is none of my business, sort of thing.
Yeah. Gosh. So when you got back to your car, how did you feel afterwards?
I was really shaken up, and I didn't really know what to do, because obviously the reason I was out there in the first place was a
Yeah.
terrible situation. And I felt I felt like I wanted to go somewhere and try to make sense of it, but I didn't really have anywhere to go. So I think I sort of drove for a bit, but then I just got a little bit spooked, and I ended up going back and then attempting to sleep, but obviously not sleeping very well at all.
No. I can't help thinking about the parallels between this creature and the horse and your relationship at the time, because it sounds like this woman was you were talking about this being quite sort of parasitic on this really big huge horse that was kind of just feeding away. And what do you think about that? Do you think there's any kind of parallel in that?
That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I've not ever thought of that. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. It's kind of interesting. Something else that it's probably coincidence, because it was quite a long time later. I got sort of gutsy enough to risk being homeless again, got some stuff in a bag and moved out. I sort of swore off women for a while, and had like basically 2 messy relationships in a row, and then typically, as the universe does, I met the girl that then became my wife. Not long after that, I was diagnosed with a really nasty problem with my eyes. So I've got epithelial basement membrane dystrophy that causes recurrent corneal erosions, which thankfully is under control now. But
Goodness
it's
me, yeah.
it's horrifically painful. The flesh of the eyes tears
Oh
apart,
God.
basically.
What
But
what what is it caused by?
it's caused by it turns out mine's hereditary, actually. But
Right.
most people, they reckon 1 in 2,000 people, I think it is, they say that have got it, but
Yeah.
it's a shortening of the attachment of the cells of the eyes. But mine's
Okay.
literally the worst case scenario. So
Oh no.
whereas most people would get a stabbing pain in their eye and they probably think nothing of it, because it'd
Mm.
go almost as quick as it had come. Mine was tearing open to the point I went to an optician to figure out what was going on, and they thought, I wear a thumb ring, but they thought I'd had a loose bit of metal on it and scratched myself in my sleep, because I had 3 holes right the way through one eye, and one right through the other.
Oh
Well,
my
while I was
goodness
in there,
me.
after I had the experience, I read as much as I could find on different sort of fairy sightings and old stories and old folklore, really.
Yeah.
And there was the really sort of interesting one. I can't remember exactly where the tale comes from, but the midwife that's called away and
That's right. Yes.
gets poked in the eye.
That's right.
And I
Yeah.
thought, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
Yeah, it's hard to know, isn't it? That almost this idea that you've seen too much, you've seen into the other world and you've seen too much.
yeah. Well, it's sort of fun enough. I was reminded because I've just read a really, really brilliant book, actually. I don't know if you're aware of it, but Wild Marjoram Tea, it's recently come out on a small press imprint called Broodcombe Press, I think it is. Yeah, I like the idea of the story, and
Yeah.
it all sort of relates to sort of folklore and fae folk and stuff, and the story is very much like that. So but it's a really, really interesting story, and it obviously has certain things that are almost sacrament to these old fae stories.
Yeah.
There is a part in there to do with one of the characters' eyes, and I think that's what made me think, hang on, that was obviously there was a gap between what I saw and what happened to me, but eventually ended up with these horrific eye problems.
Yeah, it's, I could understand why you would think that. Yeah. So do you think after that point, do you think that that kind of marked a shift for you in any way? It sounds like things started to change for you.
Yeah, I think in a way it possibly it possibly sounds strange, but I suppose it sort of marked a time where I felt sort of so insignificant in the world, but my problems seemed, you know, what if you're insignificant, the problems to you are even less significant than that. It's sort of it's how significant can my problems be if I'm I suddenly had this feeling of sort of now feel that I've got, for me at least, confirmed evidence that I share this planet with things that I had no idea even existed.
Yeah.
And I felt a little bit like I don't know. I think I heard someone say once about, they were talking about sound and sound waves and how the human ear hears sound waves between certain frequencies, obviously. And then obviously it was something I'd never really given any thought to before, and it suddenly the penny dropped with me, and I thought, well, surely light frequency and how the eye works is very similar in a way. And so there are going to be things that are invisible. I mean, germs. Germs were sort of demonic to our sort of ancestors, weren't they? Because they were these invisible forces that were definitely there, but you couldn't see them, and they could harm you. And but then I thought, well, we're at one with the idea of things that can be too small for us to see, but I think it's sort of kind of interesting to think perhaps there are things that exist on a sort of, perhaps just a frequency that we're not supposed to see.
Yeah, that, well, we're not used to seeing it, but I think I don't know, I like to think that's changing. I like to think that we are kind of raising our vibration, albeit slowly, and we are catching more and more glimpses that maybe this is something that we're on the precipice of understanding, and that this is the next kind of step of evolution for us. Because like you say, lots of us have seen now. It's not something that someone can tell you. You've imagined it, like you and I and so many other people that have seen. We know. People could tell you that you're making it up until they're blue in the face, but you know.
Yeah.
And they're just trying to make sense of something that they haven't experienced.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing. I mean, before I'd seen this, someone told me the story. I think I'd probably be in a mindset of, I would like to think that I would probably assess the friend and go, well, he's never lied to me before. I would, I believe he's seen something, and I think there's a sort of inbuilt arrogance in people that sort of doesn't want to push their mind any further than it'll go.
Yeah.
And in my experience, when we'd done magic and certainly Ouija boards are an obvious example. The only people I knew that had really been damaged by doing Ouija boards were the ones that were doing it as a joke, because they thought it was just a mess around. Someone's going to push the glass. And we used to sort of do all sorts of stuff, like sort of stand back away from the table and let the glass move on its own. And we've done all kinds of sort of weird sort of bits and pieces in the past. And sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. But the only people I can think of, I mean, we did a lot when we were youngsters. We used to joke, and I used to refer to it as the dead telephone, because we become so sort of, I guess they say, fair to the whole sort of idea, really. It was just an acceptance that it was going to work, and we were going to speak to something or someone, that had possibly passed over, and we would get some sort of information. And sometimes we got something that was quite malicious, and sometimes we got something that was actually quite interesting to talk to. And but the only times I ever saw it really harm people were people that didn't really go in with a open mind about it, really. Or, you know, I felt in my experience, if people went believing it would work and nervous, they tended to get on better than the ones who were very bolshy and were just, yeah, this is a lot of old rubbish, give me a go sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, they were the crowd that I think it gave me the idea that if your belief system changes that radically overnight, it alters you.
Yeah.
It really does. And it can be quite a nasty experience.
Yeah, it's learning the hard way for sure. I mean, it sounds like maybe people like that had more to learn, but then, but that's very much the hard way, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's quite important to bring. I mean, I don't know. I just have this idea that it's important to bring your kids up with some faith. I mean, faith can be really damaging as well, can't it? It's really hard, but
a very tricky balance. We I tried to teach our kids and read them fairy tales and bits and pieces, and encourage them to sort of go the sort of Tolkien and and Harry Potter. But I think I don't think childhood is childhood without magic. I think it was was it Einstein that was sort of, if you want to teach your children to be average, teach them math. So I'm paraphrasing this horribly, I'm sure, but if you want your kids to grow up to be enlightened, read them fairy stories. I think you know, I think essentially what he's trying to say is, like, you know, you're better off growing up with an imagination and some likelihood of changing the world than you are, you know, just having a load of old-fashioned facts that possibly aren't even facts by the time you've grown up.
Yeah, that's it. It's part of our makeup. That's what makes us human beings, I think, you know, with souls and spirit. It's just so fundamental to us, isn't it? I was thinking about the horse. Did you see the colour of it?
It was brown. It was very similar in colour to the creature itself.
Yeah.
Which I think is why I at first saw a horse, and then as I got closer, I realised that there was something, not right.
Because I was thinking about it in the Thorn. I'm wondering if it might have been hawthorn, which again, or you know, any of the thorn really are kind of related to fae. But yeah, I wonder if it was nibbling on hawthorn.
It could have been. I could probably check that, because probably sounds a little bit weird, but when I finished work, I tend to drive the sort of scenic route home, and quite often drive over that place, and I could stop and have a look, actually.
It might be interesting to have a look.
Could well be hawthorn. I mean, it may not be, because I'm sure that's something I would have noticed. But then again, actually, it was only after I had that experience that I started to take this fae stuff more seriously and read on it more. So I then, you know, became, and obviously I then sort of went down the path of looking into herbalism and bits and pieces, and reading some Daniel Schulke's books on it, and all kinds of bits and pieces. I'm surrounded by stuff here, but and
the other thing I was thinking of was so by the time you saw it, you say it was kind of early hours, maybe. What sort of time?
Yeah, I would have said it was probably between 12 and 1.
Okay.
I reckon maybe a little bit later, actually, I guess, by the time I'd driven out there.
What kind of time of year was it?
It was around this time of year, I guess. It was autumnal, early sort of autumn. I remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Going into the darkness.
This would have been, I think this would have been about sometime between, I think it would have been about 2003.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Was there any noise from it at all? Were there any noises?
The noise was what made me realise. I think I was probably, from what I remember, walking up the path, sort of, looking at my feet, that sort of
Yeah.
depressed person thing. There was a noise that made me look up, and it was rustling in the undergrowth, and that was the horse
The
itself, I
horse.
believe, made that noise. But
Yeah.
obviously, this is the interesting thing. They seem to sort of hover between the physical and the spiritual realm, because if it was something that was purely spirit, it would be sort of a harder job to sort of rustle through the undergrowth, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. This
it's
is really true. This is really
yeah.
true.
I heard an interview with someone a couple of months ago. They were talking about Bigfoot, so totally different subject, but it was kind of interesting. They were mentioning about the idea of Bigfoot being a spiritual thing, hence how it's quite hard to find.
Yeah.
And then someone pointed out about these footprints, and then they said, well, interestingly, spirits, there's nothing to say spirits don't have an effect on our physical lives, because poltergeists and things like that, they throw things around. You sort of it's widely sort of seen as being a spirit. It's yeah, and I thought it was kind of an interesting thing, and relating it now to this creature on the horse. It maybe there's something similar to that idea. I don't know, that sort of crossover, but I don't know. Another thing that sort of sprung to mind is it's the scene of sort of various sort of bloody takeovers, bodies found there now and then, I think. So
God,
yeah.
so much suffering, isn't there?
Yeah.
The horse, I was wondering whether that could have been an old battle horse.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because there was because the nearest thing, it's not really hairy, so well, not that I've read about, but the nearest sort of fey creature I've sort of heard of and read stories about, sometimes what kind of reminds me of what I saw was
Is it the puka?
No, it was the red cap.
Okay.
And I remember, this thing didn't have clothing on, so obviously it wouldn't be the same thing. And as far as I know, the red cap's sort of more north anyway. But yeah, I read I think it was an old military record or something, and there was some story anyway saying that after a battle and there were bodies lying around, yeah, this guy comes back to consciousness in this sort of battle. I think it was the English Civil War. That's what I'm picturing anyway. I might be wrong about that as well, actually. It was a long time ago I read it. But he comes back to consciousness and he's looking around, and obviously he's surrounded by dead bodies where he's been knocked unconscious. And the battle sort of, obviously, I guess, raged on and either moved on or sort of fizzled out while he's been laid unconscious. And he sees this ruined wall near him, and he recognises the body of his captain or commander, whatever you call it in those times. He goes to move towards it, and he sees movement near it, and it's this weird grey brown creature, and it's crawling up the body of his captain. And he realises the captain's got this horrible wound in his chest. This creature's drinking from the blood of the chest, and it's horrible sort of spiky sort of hands, and it ends up, it sort of dips its clothing into this cavity in this leader's chest, and then when it realises it's being watched, it scampers backwards from what I remember, and lies in the mud and the blood of the battle, and it's sort of, he described it as it shakes itself on all its limbs and it sinks into the ground. And it's a really creepy tale, really horrible. But it's fascinating, really. That's sort of even if only 1% of these things are true, it's still mind blowing.
That's it. There's something happening. Even if, as you say, they can't all be fully substantiated, but that's where people like us and lots of others like us, we're able to at least speak to each other and know that we're not mad, because so many of us have had these experiences. So what do you sort of look back on? How do you look back on that now, what happened to you that time? How do you fit that into your life now?
I think it's I think it's just life-changing in a way, because it's reinforced my sense of the magical. It's I suppose a good analogy would be when I've spoken to people before and they've sort of said, do you believe in aliens? They think, well, the universe is so big that mathematically it seems unlikely there wouldn't be any. So
Yeah.
I now kind of feel that if there are creatures around that can literally sort of phase themselves out of my vision right in front of my eyes, then why, then it seems unlikely walking through a wood that there's not something else there that you're not necessarily aware of, or not fully aware of. I mean, I think we've all probably, I suspect you have, but I suspect most people have had experiences where they've walked through woods or forests or sort of rural areas, and they've had that feeling of being watched, and they've had that feeling of something perhaps being going on nearby, and there's all sorts, the rustles in the undergrowth and stuff, but you don't see what it is. You assume that perhaps it was a rabbit, or or a badger perhaps, or something like that, but we don't know. That's the interesting thing. I think there is that thing. I think you do feel it. It's not something it's something you sense. It's I mean, like when you said to me about sort of how did you feel when you saw the creature on the horse? I mean, there was immediately. I think there was a split second where I saw the horse and thought, it's just a horse, and there was a brief sort of split second of relief that whatever was big and making noise in the undergrowth was a horse, and then there was something wrong, and that's what made me look harder. And obviously then I saw the creature. I mean, it's goblin like. I suppose that's the only, almost like one of the like a really nasty version of one of the sort of proud likes. Proud or prude. I never remember.
I've heard people call him Frood as well, and I've called him Froud, and then I wasn't sure. Would you say that it was quite menacing, that being?
Yes. I mean, I've looked back on it afterwards and thought, well, it didn't actually make any movement towards me, really. It sort of kind of jiggled around and kind of looked like it was trying to get a tighter grip on the horse. And craned round staring at me, but it didn't make movements like it was going to climb down off the horse and run towards me or anything like that, thankfully. But I don't know, there was a sort of, I don't know, I suppose almost like maybe just a sort of, maybe just a mischief about it, like a Pan-like character of nature's archetype of that chaotic being that, on one hand could be quite nice, and on another hand could be really malicious, and it was often somewhere in between. So, because but to be fair, there was nothing about it that sort of nothing shouted sort of that there was anything pleasant about it. But
no, with the teeth as well, that's it's funny, isn't it? I think you sort of the sharp teeth are always sort of associated with something quite nasty. Because what does it need those teeth for? It's horrible to think about, really.
I'm
I'm
glad it was a good few miles away from my house here.
That's right. Did you finish the relationship after that?
Yes, it would have been quite soon after that.
So it just might have marked that, that sort of end of that as well. Or maybe, I don't know, whether that kind of encouraged you to finish, to kind of get out of an abusive relationship, I mean.
I think it certainly helped. I think it was sort of, I mean, who knows, maybe it was something I needed at the time. I mean, like I said, I've sort of, I've got through the roughest parts of my life with escapism, so it certainly took my mind off my other problems for a while. and gave me a sort of fascination. And I'm kind of, if I get interested in something, I want to sort of read as much as I can. But to be honest, it hasn't really helped with that because, as we
There's
said
nothing
earlier on, I've not got any reference points to it.
Well,
So,
somebody might have, somebody might
mm,
have. Well, thanks very much. That is just
yeah,
a really fascinating and brilliant encounter, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if anyone else can kind of come forward.
yeah.
So let's see.
Time to
I'm sure you'll agree that was a fascinating collection of experiences from our guest, and again I send our thanks to him for sharing his most personal reflections and being so honest about situations in his life at the time. Hearing these first-hand testimonies are powerful because they're weaved into our lives along with suffering and moments of personal growth. We don't often talk openly about these periods in our lives that with hindsight often shape us as a person. Our paths can be bumpy, but the important thing to remember is that change is always possible and is of course the one thing you can be sure of in life. The description of the main fairy encounter is extremely unnerving and vivid. As he says, it does sound archaic, as if this creature emerged from deep within what Plato described as the soul of the world. These ideas are discussed further in Patrick Harpur's excellent book, Daemonic Reality. It's like an archetypal daemon of sorts, but what invoked it? Was it an aspect, a personification of the landscape and its layers of bloody battles? Or summoned by the occult practices which our guest confirms had taken place there multiple times? Could it be the resonance of intense suffering that our guest had been experiencing and which drew him there that night? When I have spoken with people who've seen terrible, frightening beings, it's more often taken place at a time of suffering. Perhaps it's the landscape's own resonance which draws these battles, rituals, and beings, both of this world and others. As such, could this landscape act as a doorway? A liminal space between our human world and those of spirit and other worlds. Our guest had very much felt like an outsider in this world at the time, and so naturally he felt drawn to this doorway, and two worlds met when he came face to face with the wretched rider in the Thorn. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Have you ever experienced anything similar, or read accounts of these beings? Contact me at scarletofthefae.com, where there's a contact link. Don't forget there's a bonus episode on patreon.com, the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, which continues this conversation and we hear more from our guest. Upon the path of learning, we can encounter the sublime and the shuddersome, but we are, of course, projecting our own sense of intent onto these beings, and we don't yet know the true meaning of these experiences. But we can trust our instincts and remain curious.